We shall study proceedings with recitation of Holy Quran. For this, I would like to invite on stage Mr. Ahmad Ali to please recite some verses from the Holy Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم صدق الله العظيم. I would like to request to recite Durood Sharif on our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sallu ala al-Habib sallallahu ta'ala ala Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam.
Jazakallah. As you all must be aware, that International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, ISBA, has issued a revised and restructured Code of Ethics in 2018. Significant changes have been made in the revised code. It has now been restructured and revised for ease of use and navigation. Further, various new ethical requirements have been introduced by ISBA in the last 4 years, which includes new requirements on long association of key audit personnel with the PIEs, public interest entities, and NOCLAR, and various other changes. These changes have been incorporated in the revised code. Accordingly, the Auditing Standards and Ethics Committee of ICAP undertook a very detailed and comprehensive study on the restructured code, and as a result, an exposure draft was circulated on 4th of April by ICAP for members' comments. Last date for members' comments is 3rd of May 2019. To further raise awareness among members, the Institute has arranged 3 seminars on the revised code. This is the first seminar, and the other 2 seminars would be conducted in Lahore and Islamabad on the 22nd and 23rd of April, respectively. Now we shall proceed towards the presentation. For the presentation, I would like to request Mr. Harun Tabriz, who is a fellow chartered accountant, chairperson accounting and law, and faculty member at the Institute of Business Administration, to please come on stage for his presentation.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So the Code of Ethics is now restructured into 4 parts. Part 1 would be the compliance with the code, the fundamental principles, the conceptual framework. Part 2 is about chartered accountants in business. Part 3 is about chartered accountants in practice. And Part 4 is about the independent standards for audit, review, assurance engagements. We would be covering summarized in a summarized format all these parts. Complying with the code is the first part, and this new code now has a change. The numbers have 2 letters, R or A. Letter R denotes this is a requirement. Everyone has to comply with that. And the letter A, it provides context, it is the explanations, it is the suggestions which every chartered accountant should know. So just like international accounting standards, international financial reporting standards, we have some part in bold and some part which is not in bold. Bold is the requirement, and the part which is not bold is explanation of that requirement. The requirement is that a chartered accountant shall comply with the code, and where the laws or regulations they preclude compliance, then you are allowed to not comply with that, and laws and regulations would prevail. We would do that later in the chapter. A chartered accountant shall evaluate significance of any breach of the code that is identified, and after the breach, a chartered accountant shall take actions to address the breach, and then he should determine whether to report the breach to the relevant parties. The relevant parties could be a professional body, a regulatory body, or an oversight body. We would do that later in the stage. The code has the same fundamental principles that were carried over from the last code, and the chartered accountant has to comply with all the fundamental principles of ethics. These principles establish the standard of behavior that is expected from a chartered accountant. When there is a conflict, then a CA has to consult within the firm. This is the first part. Then he may choose to consult with those charged with governance, then consult with the professional body, then with the regulatory body, and then with the legal counsel. At the end of this presentation, we will discuss how this conflict will be resolved. We have a separate slide for that. Now, the fundamental principles are integrity. Integrity is to be straightforward, honest in all professional business relationships, and integrity implies fair dealing, truthfulness. A chartered accountant should not be associated with a false or misleading information in the financial statements. He should not be reckless in providing this information, and he should not omit or obscure information in a fashion in which the financial statements appears to be misleading. There is an exception to this, that when a modified opinion is given, this is not supposed to be a false or omission of information. The second principle is objectivity. Objectivity means that a chartered accountant should not be biased. There should not be any conflict of interest. There should not be undue influence from others to override the professional and business judgments. Conflict of interest is when you are undertaking more than one activity and the interest of different parties conflict with each other. The interest of chartered accountant may conflict with the client's interest may conflict with another client's interest. So a chartered accountant should always be unbiased and should not be under any influence. The third fundamental principle is professional competence. Professional competence and due care means that a chartered accountant should be knowledgeable and should have the requisite skills which the consulting activities would require. This competence requires that you attain the competence. First you obtain these competencies, and then you maintain these competencies. We have an elaborate examination system which assures that the competencies are attained. We have a training requirement which assures that competencies are obtained. And then we have the CPD which assures that professional competence is maintained throughout the career. And the chartered accountant should act diligently in accordance with applicable technical and professional standards. Now, diligence means you have to be careful, you should be thorough, and you should make timely decisions. And you must ensure that your staff has appropriate training and they are supervised. You should not give tasks to staff which do not have those competencies. The fourth principle is confidentiality. Information is confidential. It should not be shared with third parties without proper authority. Client must authorize information to be released to others unless there is a legal or professional right or duty, unless it is under the law or under regulations. Now, disclosure is required by law when a court asks for documents in a legal proceeding, or a professional body or an oversight body asks the audit firm to comply with the quality control requirements. Then you have to give this information. The fifth principle is professional behavior. Professional behavior is that you must comply with the relevant laws and regulations and avoid discrediting the profession. You should not impair the integrity, objectivity, and reputation of the profession. So these five fundamental principles must be adhered to at all times. The second part is the conceptual framework. This is something which is new in this code. Conceptual framework provides an approach of how to deal with these ethical dilemmas. You must identify threats to the compliance of fundamental principles. Then you must evaluate what is the extent, what is the impact of these threats, and then you must address the threats. You must mitigate them, or you must reduce them to an acceptable level. For this, you must exercise professional judgment. Now, professional judgment means that you should take the whole context into your decision. And a chartered accountant must know that certain information may be missing. They must know that facts could be inconsistent with each other. They must know that sufficient expertise, experience is not available within the firm or within the organization to get to the right conclusion. A chartered accountant may have their own preconceptions or biases which clouds the judgment, or there may be more than one conclusion. You may arrive at the conclusion, but there is another conclusion which is a better one. So you must be aware of all the conclusions, all the alternatives. And the code suggests that you should do a third-party test. A third-party test is that a chartered accountant should reach to the same conclusions with the information that a reasonable third person may reach using the same information. जो information आपके पास है उसी को इस्तेमाल करते हुए एक third person उसी conclusion पर पहुंच जाए जिस conclusion पर आप पहुंचे थे, तो इसका मतलब है कि आपका conclusion सही था. That third party may be an accountant or may not be an accountant. If they are not an accountant, then they must have the knowledge and experience which is required for accounting profession. Now, there are threats to compliance, and the first part of the ethical problem solving is that a chartered accountant shall identify all the threats. Threats may be created by broad range of facts and circumstances. Contexts different ho sakte hain. It is not possible to define each and every situation that creates threats. So the code only lists down certain illustrations. It is not possible to make up a list जिसको हम टिक करके और सारे threats को identify कर लें. So a checklist approach is not feasible there. And a chartered accountant has to make a professional judgment about it. So the focus should be that all the threats should be reduced to an acceptable level. And the acceptable level is the third party test, that your conclusion is the same as a third party, that there is no ethical dilemma. And threats may be quantitative, qualitative, or they may be a hybrid of both of them. So the threats to fundamental principles are classified into 5 different classes. And the first is the self-interest. Self-interest, that financial interest or any other interest may influence the chartered accountant in making a judgment. Now, the second threat could be the self-review threat. Self-review threat is that you cannot evaluate the results of something which you have done yourself. You cannot review your own work. You cannot review something which you or your team has done previously. Then there is a threat of advocacy. Advocacy threat is a chartered accountant should not promote clients or employers' position such that the objectivity is compromised. The fourth threat is the familiarity threat, that long or close relationships with a client, employer or a chartered accountant makes the chartered accountant sympathetic up towards making a conclusion. And the last threat is the intimidation threat, that you are forced or coerced by a third party or maybe a close party, close relatives, immediate family from making up a judgment about something. We will discuss this later. Now, the framework says that whenever an ethical situation comes up, you must identify the threats, you must evaluate the significance of the threats, and then you must apply safeguards